Every year, about 49 million students attend public schools in America. Of those, roughly 22 million come from low-income families, and nearly 20 million are Black, Latino, or American Indian. If things don't change, more than a quarter of these young people won't finish high school with their class. Many of those who do graduate will have skills that are about the same as those of more advantaged students at the end of middle school. Some will enter college, but most won't finish. By age 24, in fact, more than 8 in 10 young people in America from upper-income families will have at least a bachelor's degree. Among young people from low-income families, only 1 in 10 will. Now, there is nothing about these children or their lives that makes such results inevitable. In fact, if we wanted to, we could turn these patterns around in less than a decade. Indeed, some schools and some colleges already have. And they do that by focusing on the things that matter, on quality teaching, on high expectations, and demanding content. Unfortunately, most of our schools do exactly the opposite. They take the kids who enter school behind academically, and they give them less of everything that we know makes a difference. We created the Education Trust for a single reason, and that is to lead an all-out assault on these inequities. Our job is to push, to prod, and cajole our country toward simple justice, toward providing quality education to all of our children, and to remind Americans that if they don't want to do this just because it's the right thing to do, the just thing to do, they ought to do it to save our collective economic skins. After all, these children now comprise more than half of our young people. The Education Trust goal is to close the yawning gaps in educational opportunity and achievement that consign far too many young Americans to lives on the margins. We focus intently on what schools and colleges can do, not on what they can't, to provide all kids with a fair shot at success. We know from long experience that good schools can absolutely transform the life trajectories of poor children. We also know that these schools should be the rule, not the exception. So how do we go about our work? First, we work with educators, parents, and activists all over the country to help them transform local schools and colleges into institutions that serve all students to a high standard. Second, we analyze mounds of data, point out opportunity and achievement gaps, and help with solutions. Our data provoke concern and outrage, but we also inspire hope when we identify institutions that teach our most vulnerable students to a very high standard. And finally, we participate very actively in policy debates, using lessons that we learn from practice work and from the data to build the case for equitable policies. We do this with no allegiances to any political party. We partner with people on both sides of the aisle, and we've made people on both sides angry too. The way we figure it, frankly, if we annoy both sides equally, we're actually doing our job. What do we need to get this done? Mostly it's about terrific people and the tools that they need to engage with local activists and spread our message far and wide. From the beginning, we've leveraged successive improvements in federal policy to help accomplish our goals. Not frankly because we're enamored of policy. I probably shouldn't say this, but we actually aren't. But changes in federal policy turn out to be a very fast way to focus the attentions of schools and colleges on the kids they typically ignore. And federal policies have also been a fast way to get both schools and students the resources they need. But because issues before Congress also get lots of media attention, the periodic reauthorizations of federal education policies are also an opportunity for us to focus the attention of the American people more broadly, helping them to understand current achievement patterns and helping them to understand what must be done to improve them. They're also a terrific opportunity for us to broaden our alliances, engaging local activists in speaking up for their kids. Although federal policy is absolutely critical, because a single DC-based organization can't possibly influence policy in all 50 states and all 15,000 school districts, We also know that federal policy has its limits. Today, to go the distance for poor kids and kids of color, we will need to harness the power of state policy and will need to energize local activists. We have two state offices, EdTrust West in California and EdTrust Midwest in Michigan, but we think we can do much more by forging deep connections with this feisty new generation of state-based advocacy organizations and with the newly energized state affiliates of national civil rights organizations. Several years ago, we were named by Education Week as the most influential voice in education for the decade. And in 2011, we were named as one of the two most effective advocacy organizations in Washington. Interestingly, this time, right behind the National Education Association, whose $399 million annual budget dwarfs ours, and which spent $133 million last year on external lobbyists, to our zero. We think our success as an organization is mostly, frankly, about not thinking of ourselves as successful, but rather focusing, as we do every day, on the enormous job still to be done. But if you made us list what contributes to the successes we have had, we'd say the following. First, an unswerving focus on our mission of improving opportunities and outcomes for low-income students and students of color. Second, a staff that is more talented and more hardworking and more richly diverse than that of any other education organization in Washington. Third, we have roots in real work in real schools and colleges rather than simply a pie-in-the-sky think tank. Fourth, we have a reputation that we guard fiercely for accurate, clear, and trustworthy data, and a willingness to go wherever the data takes us. Fifth, we take a deliberately bipartisan approach to policy, and we have a track record of building strong coalitions of surprising, in fact, sometimes shocking allies. Sixth, we have long-standing relationships with mainstream journalists, especially editorial boards, and a rapidly escalating presence in new media as well. Seventh, we have generous funders who've been willing to provide flexible resources that allow us to pivot when new opportunities arrive. And finally, we have an absolute willingness to say what needs to be said or do what needs to be done, no matter whom it aggravates. First, we're the data people. What matters to us is student results. We track and report on whether achievement levels and graduation rates are going up, whether more students are entering and succeeding in college, and most importantly, whether gaps between groups are narrowing. But we also track what we're doing and what impact it has. What legislation has been introduced based on our recommendations, for example. In 2011, we helped shape teacher quality and equity bills, bills on comparability of finance, and the Department of Education's state waiver policy. What's the size of our press audience and our social media impact? In the first quarter of 2011 alone, we reached over 40 million people. How many organizations have we brought along, and how diverse are they? We organized over 60 groups in a letter asking the President and Congress to help save Pell, and we built a coalition to oppose a Senate bill rolling back accountability that included business organizations, civil rights groups, disability organizations, and ed reform folks. We count our outputs, that means publications and recommendations, data shows that we make from new data sets, how many briefings and Hill meetings, how many coalition meetings have we attended, how many have we led, how many journalists and bloggers and editorial boards have we spoken with, how many activists, policymakers, and organizations and journalists are seeking us out. Then we look at quality and strategy. Basic question is this: are we driving change with everything we've got, or is something big missing? And when we realize that there's an important missing piece, we act, and we act immediately. Our public image sometimes reminds me of that story of the blind men trying to describe a camel based on the one part of the animal they touched. Policymakers in Washington, for example, know us as an unusually strong policy shop, but they might not know, for example, about the gap-closing work we do with colleges and university systems, or the assistance we provide to local community-based organizations. In much the same way, the countless school and district leaders who look to our team for help in identifying more effective instructional or counseling practices often don't know much about our policy work. People in K-12 tend to think of us as an organization focused on them, not about our higher education work. And higher education folks think we are all about assisting, or sometimes, frankly, torturing them. Because we are one of the only education groups that deliberately works with both Republicans and Democrats, folks are often confused about our politics, too. Foot-draggers on the Republican side often describe us as Democrats, and liberal foot-draggers on the Democratic side often describe us as tools of the Republicans or tools of the business community. Frankly, though, if we annoy both sides equally, we figure we're probably doing our job. It's probably easiest to talk about our accomplishments in 4 big buckets, each of them important in a different way. First are our major policy wins, beginning with the changes to Title I back in 1994 that ended the long-standing practice of taking money away from high-poverty schools that improve, and including over time changes to federal teacher policy, to school accountability, funding equity, and protection of the federal Pell Grant for low-income college students. Second are our wins of a different sort, our wins in identifying and focusing energy on the next frontier of educational reform, what we call our Paul Revere function. A few examples: our 1998 report, Good Teaching Matters, that helped to inspire the current effort to identify and reward effective teachers; our 1999 report, Ticket to Nowhere, that launched the notion that college and career readiness should be the goal of high schools and helped to lay the foundation for the current Common Core state standards. And our College Results Online series helped galvanize the current focus on college completion. Third is the leadership role we have played in dragging educators and the country more generally to understand the capacity of all of our children to achieve at high levels, to stop the inequitable practices that expand achievement gaps, and to start the practices that close them. Every year, our Dispelling the Myth award-winning schools demonstrate that ordinary educators who work hard, pay attention to every detail, and who are driven by relentlessly high expectations for all students are raising achievement and closing gaps in unexpected places all across the nation. These schools give hope to educators and community activists all over the country, and they take away excuses for inaction. Finally, there are our accomplishments in pushing far more data about the achievement of all students into public view and helping countless Americans, educators, parents, community groups, policymakers, and journalists understand and tell the stories behind those numbers. Our Paul Revere function, which has us looking ahead to identify the next frontier of reform work, often puts us so far out ahead on an issue that people think we're crazy or naive, tilting at windmills, they often say. When we released Good Teaching Matters back in 1998, for example, nobody was thinking about the importance of effective teachers, especially as measured by their students' growth. When we called on high schools to educate all students as if they were bound for college, the idea was widely criticized as naive. When we developed our first College Results Online tool, we actually had to prove that student success wasn't just about what students did, but also about what colleges did. Now these ideas have basically become commonly accepted. But our challenges, frankly, aren't just about issues. We also face the challenge of belief. A lot of Americans still think that we're a fair society, that unequal results are about the failings of those kids or their families, not the lousy schools and weak teachers we provide them with. And too many people, whether they admit it or not, still hold the fundamentally racist belief that kids of color learn less because they are, well, kids of color. They don't believe in the potential of all of our kids. That lack of belief in the capacity of all of our children is a huge barrier for us. It gives people a great excuse for not taking political action, for not changing education systems, and for not expecting the same opportunities for all of our children. To accomplish our mission, we need additional resources in 4 basic areas. First, as a wonderful new generation of state and local advocacy organizations, including affiliates of civil rights organizations, steps up, we need to help them master both the substance of equity-oriented education reform and also the craft of advocacy. More resources would enable us to build out our field department, as well as to add the policy and data staff necessary to support the growth and development of the state and local advocates. We badly need to diversify an education reform movement in this country that, with the exception of our very diverse leadership and staff, is still, frankly, mostly white. Second, we don't have nearly sufficient staff to respond to demand for help from school districts and college and university systems. With more support, we could build out our practice teams and use both in-person and multimedia vehicles to get their expertise more widely used. Third, as states and systems build new data systems and the federal government collects more data, we need to make that information readily accessible, including via new web tools and apps, to activists, policymakers, and educators in ways that both inflame outrage about things as they are, but also inspire hope about things as they could be. Finally, we need support to accelerate our progress in using technology and new media as effectively as we've used traditional media. We're still number 1 in old media, but we aim to be number 1 in the new. If we're going to change the long-standing practice of giving vulnerable kids less of everything that matters in education, we have to take the fight for fairness in schools and colleges to states and communities all across the country. A national network of state-based champions for equity is ripe for the making. We will make hard-hitting data, careful research on what works and what doesn't, and common-sense policy solutions more widely available to activists around the country who lack good tools to advance the cause. They will need data they can use to tell the story to local audiences. They will need support in identifying and prioritizing the issues. They will need media attention for their work. They'll need support in staying committed. They'll need a mechanism for getting and staying connected to each other. And when the action is state or nationwide, they will need a means for keeping on top of current developments. To remain leaders in the fight for equity, we will expand our field team, identify partners, and build learning across organizations. We'll build new web-based data tools and mount coordinated grassroots campaigns on key issues. That way, we can change the face of advocacy in this country. We can strengthen local and state groups, build leadership in communities of color, and significantly advance the needs of low-income students and students of color, the very young people who together now comprise a majority of America's children.